Welcome to Riding Counsel with Rich Jaffe, where the open road meets expert advice. I'm Richard Jaffe, an attorney and biking enthusiast, and this is the podcast where we dive into the world of motorcycling, safety, culture, charitable giving, and riding right. So, whether you're a seasoned rider or just getting started, let's talk bikes, the road, and everything in between. Let's ride! Hello, everyone out there in Riding Podcast Land. Listen to me. It's Riding Counsel, silly boy. RidingCounsel.com. It's the Riding Counsel podcast. And I am one of your hosts. My name is Rich Jaffe. I'm the guy that can't really speak very well, apparently, but I am an attorney. I am a podcaster, and I am a motorcycle enthusiast, and I have something really good for you here today on this episode of Riding Counsel. It's about kids. When a child is injured on a motorcycle, the case isn't just about the crash. It's about parenting, judgment, and blame. And today we're going to break it down and tell you what really happens when a kid gets hurt on a bike and how quickly a family's decision ends up on trial. Hello, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for listening, for subscribing, liking, sharing. And I already introduced myself, Rich Jaffe, ridingcounsel.com, RidingCounsel.com. And I'm here today, like most days, with my good friend Million. Million, how you doing?
Well, I am doing well. It's a pleasure to be here. Always fun to talk about this stuff, but we are pivoting into a little more of a serious topic today. This is, a rider's one thing, but now you get children in this, it takes on a whole different animal. So we got to discuss this, my friend. So
yeah, whenever kids are involved, things heat up. It gets a little more serious because you're not only dealing just yourself, you're dealing with kids who may not be able to make decisions for themselves,
even fully kind of understand in a lot of cases what's going on. So
right.
Well, look, diving right in. So if a kid is injured on a motorcycle, what factors immediately come to mind that change it from a standard adult crash, or what's the difference from the top?
Yeah, it's a whole new ball game, okay? Because God forbid a child is involved in a motorcycle accident. And when I'm talking child, it could be anybody 18 or under, really under 18, right? It could be 17, 16, and age is really just a number. But when you're talking about mental capacity of somebody who is riding a motorcycle when they're 16, maybe they are, not mature enough to really know and understand the risks involved in riding a motorcycle. And who's going to know that better than the parents of that boy or girl? So if a child is in an accident, so many things come into play. Most of all, it's going to be the judgment of the parents saying whether or not that child can ride. So it really comes into play very quickly, because that's the first question after is the kid okay? After the kid is okay the question always comes, why did that child why were they allowed to ride a motorcycle? And it's going to go back to the parents. There's a host of other differences too. When you're dealing with injuries and things like that, it could be more severe because children are younger and they tend to decompensate much faster than adults. And I know this from my paramedic days. So God forbid the injury is more serious, they're going to need care a lot faster than an adult will. And, you're talking about, if you get involved into the legal process, a judge has to be involved, because a judge always has to oversee what goes on with a case involving a child. So it can get really messy really quick.
I see it on so many levels, like you're saying, like a judge. I would imagine that in real bad cases where maybe negligence, there could be the criminal aspect of it. There could be a custody part of it if there is truly something. Now you got family, you got criminal, and make it civil. You got too many judges here.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there. And what usually happens is, as soon as somebody under 18 is involved in a motor vehicle accident or, a motorcycle accident, and they're hurt and they hire a lawyer, first of all, they need a guardian to actually watch over their case, right? So that usually is the mom or the dad. And if somebody like that is not available, then a guardian will be appointed for the child. It's called a guardian ad litem. And that's who really retains the lawyer. Then what happens is the case will proceed into litigation. And there's some rules covering things like depositions when you may or may not be able to ask a child a certain question, because when a child is involved in a deposition, that child needs to know the difference between a truth and a lie. And, if the child is too young, maybe they won't know that. And that's a judicial determination that has to be made. But ultimately, at the end of the case, the lawyers have to do something known as an infant's compromise order. At least in New York, they do. And that's when all of the information about the case is given to the judge, and the judge actually has to make a decision as to whether or not the interests of the child are being protected. So that involves medical reports, medical records, and also the guardian has to sign off on that to say, yes, I do approve of this settlement, and I really do think it is within the child's best interest. So
Mhm.
it's before the judge can turn around and say, listen, the lawyer did a fantastic job. I'm going to approve this. The lawyer could turn around and say, look, this is not enough money for this child. I see this as a much more valuable case, and not approve the case, not approve the settlement, and send the lawyers back to work. Or the judge could do something in between. So, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, a lot of times what happens is when I have a child as a client, the judge will take a look at the case and will actually give more money to the child, but out of my fee. So that
Mhm.
happens a lot. And the judge kind of says, look, the child is more important than the lawyer. So we're going to take what the lawyer would have earned in this case, and we're going to give some of it to the child.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, a lot of responsibility here, starting from the ground floor with the actual rider. They always say that ignorance of the law is never an excuse for anything that happens. So, when it comes to laws, what are general, now, of course, it'll vary, but as a general concept, what are laws pertaining to children riding or like maybe limits? And I would assume that there's times where people ignore or just disregard these limits. So, let's get into it.
Well, a lot of times, parents would love to have their child riding a motorcycle with them. And that could be all well and good, but laws vary in different states. Some states say if that happens, a child always must wear a helmet, no matter what age that child is.
Okay.
Some say the child may ride, but until they're 16 or older, they have to wear a helmet. Some say that there's no helmet responsibility whatsoever, so it varies in that regard. Some say that if you're under 16, then you cannot be a passenger on a motorcycle at all. Some say that if it's 18, some say it's 21. So there's a lot of laws that really vary, and you really have to check the law in your state before you ride in that state. So you're not violative of that law. But I think what happens is in a motorcycle accident itself involving a child, it's the parent's decision or the guardian's decision that comes into question as to whether or not to let that child on the motorcycle, whether that child is riding alone or even with a parent. So that always comes into play. So if you are a parent, if you are a guardian, and you are responsible for a child, and that child is considering riding a motorcycle, ask you permission, keep that in mind that the focus will be on you. God forbid anything happens to that child.
Yeah. I've seen lots of cases where little kids riding on the bike with their parent having a good old time, but if you're in a state where it's like 16 or something like that, you got some problems at this point. And so let's say this was the case. We maybe disregard a law, not a big deal. It'll be fine, as everybody always says. How negligent can a parent be found simply for allowing the child to ride on a motorcycle, even if they do take precautions?
So this is another angle that gets very confusing because there's civil liability for a parent and there's criminal liability for a
Right.
parent. Okay. So if you're breaking one of these laws that say, no child should be on a motorcycle and they're under 16 or under 18, whatever state you're in, you may very well be brought up on criminal charges. I mean, I've seen it happen in a couple of states in the union. So that's criminal. And you could go to jail. You could have your children taken away from you,
Mhm.
and given to somebody else. I mean, that's what you're risking. So that happens in some states. So you really got to be careful on the criminal side. On the civil side, at least in New York, believe it or not, you cannot hold a parent responsible for negligence in letting their child ride the motorcycle. So it's more of a moral thing. It's more of an ethical thing, and it will come into play because when you go to trial, and that child is injured because of the motorcycle accident, 9 times out of 10, the parents are up there, and even if nobody can ask the parents a direct question like, "Do you think it's good parenting?" Their judgment as to whether or not to let that child ride a motorcycle or be a passenger on a motorcycle, that's definitely going to come into question and will definitely influence a jury as to whether or not they're going to give that child any money.
The word in legal circles, a lot of time the word reasonable is thrown around in different contexts. So when we look at like the term reasonable judgment, so how does like the law determine that? Like what counts as reasonable judgment for parents in cases like these?
So again, we're talking about a term of art. And when we're considering the word reasonable, that's something for a jury to decide. So it's really not a matter of law per se. It's really a matter of fact. But we all do say that it has to be reasonable. So the decision whether or not to allow a child on the motorcycle may come into play, but that's not really what is judged. It's more judged if that child was an operator of the motorcycle and whether or not that child was acting reasonably. So sometimes when you're talking about whether or not those actions were reasonable, you're talking about whether or not it's a reasonable man. Sometimes you're talking about whether or not it's a reasonable woman. Sometimes you're talking about whether or not it's a reasonable person. And sometimes you can even get a charge that a jury hears from a judge when they're given a law that they should compare it as to somebody who is reasonable, but of that age. So if you have like a 12-year-old on a scooter or something like that, you don't judge the reasonability of the 12-year-old's actions against an adult's actions. What you do is you compare that 12-year-old's actions to another 12-year-old action. So it's really a matter of a jury to come to that conclusion.
So keeping it relative to the people involved.
Right.
What it
Right.
sounds. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So let's set a scenario up here. So if someone is riding on their motorcycle, maybe they got their 10-year-old on the back, driving to school, for instance. Okay. And along the way, maybe after school on the way home, something happens. We have an accident, collision, whichever. Schools, teachers, counselors, people in the daycares, even in these situations, a lot of times are what's considered mandated reporters. So if they see something like this, they have to report it that, hey, that kid's not supposed to be there. Can schools, daycares, third parties in any way be held liable if a child is injured while riding a motorcycle in one of these situations?
So this is extremely interesting because there is a legal concept called in loco parentis, and that's a fancy legal term for essentially saying that when a child is in school or in daycare or some other location where the parents or guardians give that child over to the school or whatever entity it is for the care of that child, then the school acts as if they are the parents. So they are charged with the responsibility of taking care of that child. So, for instance, the school can be an insurer of the well-being of every child in their care. So, for instance, if a child runs out the door and hops on a motorcycle, then gets into an accident, you really can't hold the school responsible for that because that's something that they probably could not have prevented.
Okay.
But if children often run out that door and then get hurt for some reason and the school doesn't lock down that door because they knew or couldn't should have known that kids run out that door and they need to prevent it, well then you're talking about some liability on the school. Or if the school knew or they could and should have known that that child was going to get on some sort of instrumentality like a scooter or a motorcycle or something like that, during school hours, well, yeah, the school has a responsibility. But if it's after school, well, then it starts to get a little muddy, a little gray there, because maybe the school should not have released the child after school. Other factors may come into play there. But the bottom line is, while a school or a daycare can't insure every child against every single thing, they do nonetheless have a responsibility to that child to ensure his or her safety.
Wow. So in the event we have accident, collision, whichever they decide to call it in that case, It's complex, lots of just moving parts and a lot of factors here. So when we get into issues of fault, how would they, like examples of how they would look at it where maybe a driver is at fault, but then also the parent shares some of the fault because maybe they did something wrong? What are some of the nuances relating to how that they would handle that complexity?
Yeah. So, um, as a defense lawyer, if I know what angles I would play, and as a defense lawyer, I'm not really allowed in a civil action for money damages if there's an accident to bring up the fact that the parents were probably didn't use reasonable judgment
Mhm.
in allowing their child to get onto a motorcycle, or if a jury somehow thinks that they would never allow their child to get onto a motorcycle, that's just something that is used to sway the jury. So as a defense lawyer, I would try to get that in front of the jury. Look what the parents did. They let their child go on this dangerous motorcycle. They should never have been there in the first place. But the law in and of itself says that this is not even really allowed in front of the jury. But there's implications that you could make as a defense counsel. As plaintiffs, all I want to throw up there is that it's a child that's hurt. It's a child that's hurt because everybody feels bad for a
Mhm.
child. You become very sympathetic.
Mhm.
So if you look at a case and you look at it just on paper, well, yeah, you're not allowed to really throw things in about a parent's judgment letting that child on a motorcycle. So that seems to clear the way. But somehow jurors are smarter than that, and they get the picture that maybe it really is the judgment of the parents that should come into play here. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's usually an all or nothing thing. Either the jury feels really sympathetic towards that child and awards them a lot of money, or the jury feels really badly for the child, but feels even worse that the parents made a bad decision about their parenting and awards the child nothing. So it's an
Mhm.
all or nothing, and the stakes get really high.
All right, let's roll with that with the sympathetic issue. How do juries or settlements differ in cases where children are involved? Is there what are you seeing as opposed to just a single adult rider, for instance?
So, as I've explained in some of my prior episodes, there's economic damages and non economic damages, but both of these have to be projected out to the future. So, what I mean by this is if you have somebody that's, say, 85 years old that is hurt in a motor vehicle accident, a motorcycle accident, then their projected lifespan would be, say, let's call it 88. So you're talking about 3 years of future damages, which let's say, you award them $10,000 a year. So you're talking about $30,000 in future pain and suffering.
Okay.
Now, take that same scenario in a motorcycle accident and put a 10-year-old on the motorcycle,
Mhm.
or put a 15-year-old on the motorcycle, even a 17-year-old on a motorcycle. Well, now, if the projected age, the life expectancy of that child is somewhere around 88. Now you're talking at least 50 years of pain and suffering
Mhm.
that is projected out. So at if you're taking it at $10,000 a year, you're talking a lot more money that's at stake, a lot more medical expenses on the economic side that is at stake to take care of that child, as opposed to somebody who's, for instance, 85 years old and you're only talking 3 years. So, you're talking big differences here. Plus, you have to take into account that motorcycle accidents in children usually, unfortunately, involve scarring. So
Mhm.
if
Yep.
you have scarring on an 85-year-old, let's say, it's a lot different than if you have scarring on a 15-year-old boy or girl. And then you also have to talk about where the scarring is. So if the scarring is on, say, um, you know, uh, the face, well, that's going to be a lot more impactful than if the scar is on someplace that's hidden. If the scar is on somebody's leg or something like that, and it's a young girl, well, she's not going to probably want to wear skirts very much. So
Uh,
you have to consider that kind of aspect. So there's a lot to consider, but it does, in fact, impact children a lot more.
so drilling down into that just a little bit deeper. So what other factors do they include beside, the scarring and all that? I mean, like first thing that comes to my mind is if you're a young child is in an accident and maybe there's some sort of, let's say, brain injury and their brain's not fully developed yet. So, as they grow into their early 20s and that growth maybe affects that in some way. something that doesn't show up until a little later on. Is there a way to account for that? Is there a way to get something after the fact? Like, what do you do in those cases?
Well, it's a little more objective when you're a child and something like that happens, because if you're talking about mild traumatic brain injuries, concussions, things of that nature, the attitude or the manifestation of that injury is going to show up a lot more objectively in school. So, what I mean by that is if a child starts getting bad grades in math or science or language, or if the child starts acting out, or if the child is absent, or if the child loses his or her friends, or stops playing sports, or fails to show up for different clubs that they used to be in, or happen to be in a study group for a certain subject before this accident, and now after the accident just can't really hold their weight in the study group. All of these really are very strong objective pieces of evidence when a child has a mild traumatic brain injury or a concussion as a result of a motorcycle accident. Whereas if you're an adult, well, you have to try to get things from different scenarios, but it's not as objective. You're not going to get like a school grade, or it's not going to be as black and white. You really have to get people to describe how this person was before the accident and after the accident. So it's a lot more witness related when you're an adult versus a child. It's more objective where you have the records.
Wow. So now we have particular settlements that we're working on in this scenario. Now, we have a lot of situations where there's different family structures. So you may have two parents, you may have divorced parents, you may have single parents, you may have people that were never married, insignificant others, whatever you want to call that. In all these different scenarios, when parents maybe disagree on how settlement should happen, or when parents are in conflict, or there's divorce issues, or maybe pre-existing things from that, how much complication is all this causing us?
Yeah, it can cause a lot of complications later on in a case, but as a lawyer dealing with children and motorcycle accidents, you really have to be ready for that. You have to anticipate that. And I've been doing this for more than 3 decades now. So I feel like I know what's coming at me before it even comes at me. And what we try to do is we always try to make sure that the guardian is somebody who is stable in that child's life. So we do sort of an informal evaluation of the guardian, him or herself. Now, parents are known as parents and natural guardians. Okay, and if we can't get one of the parents involved that is stable, let's say, meaning they have strong ties to the community, they have a solid job, they have, say, bank accounts, and they have relatives in the area, then we have to go to the court and say, look, there's not really somebody stable here, and we'd like a guardian appointed for the purpose of this case. So it can get hairy, but the sooner you deal with this, you're much better off. And whoever signs that retainer is in charge of the case from start to finish. So all the other guardians, all the other relatives can try to chime in at the end of the case to try to get the money of the child, or to give their opinion, but it really doesn't bear on anything, because it's really the guardian who signs that retainer in the very beginning of the case that really has the final say.
Wow. All right. So we've discussed the parents, the jurors. Now, pivoting to the judges. A lot of compassion, a lot of emotion, empathy when it comes to children, for especially the younger they are. Are judges generally sympathetic with the parents for having to go through this, or they have to focus 100% strictly on the legal stuff? What are you seeing in these cases?
Well, judges, as far as what I see, are very careful, at least in New York, about what they do and what they don't do when it comes to dealing with motorcycle accidents and children. Because, as a general rule, you cannot sue a judge for what that particular judge does in a certain case, even if you don't like what the judge does. But a judge can be held personally responsible if that judge is negligent in administering what I was describing before, that infant's compromise order, where the judge is required to scrutinize all the medical information and all the legal information about how the accident happened and approve or disapprove of the settlement. So the judge is very, very careful. Otherwise, that judge will expose him or herself to personal liability. Now, judges' jobs really are to focus on the child, and they more likely than not have a lot of experience seeing a lot of these cases, seeing the value of these cases. And some judges are more aggressive than other judges in getting involved. I personally love it when the judge gets more involved in the case. Judges will call the insurance lawyers. Judges will call the insurance adjusters. They will go to bat for this child. And that's a really nice thing to see. And all the while introducing the child to the legal process is also a pretty good thing to give the legal and judicial system a lot more credibility.
Jumping to the attorneys, because being on both sides of it, as you have some experience with that, you have to have a measure of, compassion and empathy and all this, especially whichever side you're on. But then at the same time, there's a tough reality of you have a job to do. You still have to litigate. You still have to run this. How do attorneys balance this? How do they sort of keep themselves in check in all this?
Well, what they teach you in law school is don't get emotionally involved. Don't get emotionally invested into your clients, because that's somehow going to affect your judgment. My personal philosophy is quite the opposite. I like delving into the child's life. I want to know how that child is doing in school. I want to know how that child is doing socially, physically, emotionally, spiritually, how they're getting along with their parents, every single aspect of what that child had been doing before the accident and has been affected now after the accident. So I can really present this to the insurance company, to the judges, and to defense counsel to get that child top dollar. Because when something like this happens, the law doesn't allow us to take the negligent driver who hit the motorcycle and punch him in the face. I mean, that's just assault and that's criminal. But what the law does allow is for compensation, to try to make these kids whole, to try to compensate them so that later on in life, their life will be whole again. Their life will be right as if the accident didn't happen. And so I think getting involved more with these children, more with the families, is actually more beneficial, and unfortunately not what we're taught in law school.
Man.
It can be pretty rough.
A lot of emotional dynamics going on at play here.
Yeah, it really is. And children, they're special cases, and you have to be careful with them. You have to treat them with kid gloves, so to say. But I think we're going to be running out of time here pretty soon. Do you have any last question? Maybe any kind of last questions you might have?
All right. Common myths or misunderstandings that the public knows about child accident cases, and maybe some uncomfortable truths that parents need to know. Educate them, man.
I will tell you this, parents, that when your child in your care is in a accident and it involves a motorcycle and they're riding the motorcycle, or there are a passenger in a motorcycle, be prepared to be on trial yourself for your judgment in whether or not you need to be a little more careful about letting your child on the motorcycle to begin with. Just be prepared, because it's coming.
Ugh, big mess.
Yeah. So it looks like that's probably all the time we're going to have for this particular episode of ridingcounsel.com. But I really hope that everybody out there will give me a shout out by liking, subscribing, sharing. And if you have a comment, you can leave it here in this if you're on YouTube. Otherwise, you can always reach me at ridingcounsel.com, ridingcounsel.com. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Spotify. I have a podcast over there. You can find me almost anywhere. TikTok. I'm actually on the Motorcycle Mayhem radio show. That's another podcast that I do all the time. So take a look for me, and I would really appreciate any comments, any inputs. I'll try to respond to everybody out there. But until the next episode, what do you have?
I was just saying on the YouTube, if you decide to go there, just something I wanted to point out is that it's the direct link, youtube.com with a /. Then they do an @ symbol. It's riding_counsel. So that's the direct link if you just wish to go directly there.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that. Like, subscribe, share, people. Listen, share with your friends. Otherwise, listen, until the next episode, I want everybody out there to ride free, ride wild, ride safely, but you know what? Do so legally. All right, everybody. You take care.
Right,
bye-bye.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Riding Counsel with Richard Jaffe. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the ride, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your fellow riders. Until next time, keep the rubber side down and ride safe.